Good evening, and welcome to another episode of Historical Sketches. Comparisons are a little bit like bikinis. What they reveal is suggestive, but what they conceal is vital. And this principle equally applies when comparing the history of nations, as implied in the title, which echoes Gibbon's six-book monumental Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And implied in that decline and fall is the idea that the decline could have been reversed and the fall avoided. That is, the fall of the Roman Empire and the decline of the Western world. Whereas it is equally true that all that lives must die, passing through nature to eternity. Yet, suggested, though not stated in Gibbon's title, is the idea that men are responsible for the fall of empires and of nations. But a counterpart could respond with equal reason that as flies to wanton boys are we to the gods, they kill us for their sport. Or a hopeless contemporary skeptic, prompted to say what he would do with the world if it were in his power, he could reply as one Shakespearean character did when questioned on the topic: give it the beast to get rid of the men. But the argument quickly leads nowhere. Still, the best that a historical observer can do is to suggest what are the perceived, let's call them carrier themes, the carrier themes of an era, to pinpoint its dominant dynamics and to observe if the consequences fit the perceived premises. An arbitrary beginning of the decline and eventual fall of the Roman Empire could be the advent of the Emperor Diocletian, who reorganized the Roman Empire in 286 AD, splitting it first into two and then into four sub-empires, with this reorganization leading eventually to Byzantium, which is Constantinople, becoming the actual capital of the new and improved Roman Empire in 395 AD. Now, often many causes are the parents of one event. With Diocletian, one such cause was the growing influence and importance of the East. Besides, Rome had become increasingly difficult to govern, a process begun much earlier, for example with Emperor Caligula, famous for having made his horse a senator. Some chronicles and subsequent historians said that Caligula was mad. However, according to others, he only wanted to show and emphasize that the Roman Senate had become so corrupt and dysfunctional that even a horse as a senator would have been a notable improvement. Observing the results of the most recent midterm American elections, it would be difficult to disagree with Caligula, given the record, the type, and the temper of certain elected candidates. Anyway, a latter day Caligula would probably retire Biden and exchange some of his cabinet members with horses, leading to an improved economy, peace maybe, restored international standing, and reclaiming common sense as a guideline of policy. A process, this one, extendable at large to the European Union, a splendid example of public funds consumed in private luxury, where members of an unelected junta vie with each other into a shameless emulation of servitude and believe themselves to be magnificently grandiose while actually being inelegantly little. In ancient Rome, Emperor Domitian Aurelian, who ruled between 214 and 275 AD, gave the first official signal of the empire's end, when he realized that, notwithstanding some victories over the barbarians, he had delayed rather than avoided the catastrophe. Therefore, he adopted a measure that signaled the death of Rome and the beginning of the Middle Ages. In fact, he ordered the citizens of the empire to surround their cities with strong walls and fortifications, as henceforth each center was to be solely responsible for its defense. Tourists visiting various northern Italian cities will have seen or even walked on the remaining ramparts of these massive defensive monuments. The next momentous events were respectively the official entry of Christianity into the history of political Rome and the first Roman war fought in the name of religion. Facing each other were the armies of Maxentius, who represented one of the sub-empires created by Diocletian, and on the other side Constantine. The son of Constantine was the cross of Christ. As Constantine told the historian Eusebius on the day of the battle, which was on October 27, 312 AD, he had seen a flaming cross appearing in the sky with the inscribed words "In hoc signo vinces," in this sign you will win, and he won. In 330 AD, Constantine moved the capital of the empire to Byzantium, which he renamed Constantinople, and that date masks the beginning of the Eastern Roman Empire, which endured until 1453 AD. In 800 AD, Charlemagne established a new and improved Western Roman Empire. However, its capital was no longer in Rome, but in Aachen, in today's Germany. During the long interim centuries after Rome's official surrender to the barbarian chieftain Odoacer in 476 AD, it fell to the Church of Rome, but chiefly to the many abbeys founded and erected throughout Europe, to preserve and maintain the Greek-Roman culture, traditions, arts, and science. Many monasteries still afford today ample testimony of their ancient magnificence. Meanwhile, Goths, Franks, Longobards, Normans, Byzantines, and Arabs fought among themselves to decide who was ruling what part of the Italian peninsula and other lands of Europe. For the purpose of this historical comparison, I will arbitrarily choose the end of World War II as the point of observation of modern Western Europe and of the Western world. But some brief mention of previous events, not as remote as the Roman Empire, may contribute, perhaps, to making the comparison less questionable. It is commonly assumed that the French Revolution was a popular movement, though it was mostly confined to Paris and to some larger French cities, where there was discontent, of course, though this discontent was really not extraordinary. And, at least at the beginning, the upheaval resembled what we call today a color revolution. Providing the necessary funds were, among others, the new recently established Masonic lodges and the notorious Illuminatis of Bavaria, whose spiritual descendants today are Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum, among others. The Masonic lodges were the equivalent of today's National Endowment for Democracy and of Soros Antifa or Black Lives Matters or other sundry non-government organization. Usually overlooked by official history is the strong and bloody counter-revolution that took place in the rest of France and this was eventually known as the War of the Vendée, which is named after a region on the Atlantic coast. Because the countryside was more attached to what we today call traditional values. Furthermore, people did not crave, for example, for the new week made up of 10 days, where people work for 9 days instead of 6, or for the new church of the Goddess of Reason. The historical impact of the revolution and of the subsequent Napoleonic aftermath buried the notion and the fact that there was strong and ardent opposition to the revolution itself, or that the Declaration of the Rights of Men did not prevent a few thousand people from losing their head and producing, as it has been said in the end, a heap of headless corpses and a tyrant. But legend is an essential part of history, much as the founding of the United Nations in 1945 was intended to prevent further wars. One more parallel. In 1817, following the defeat of Napoleon, Britons, Prussia, Russia and Austria installed on the throne of France Louis XVIII, brother of the beheaded Louis XVI. Then the victors instituted what they call the constitutional charter, meaning elections, though with a very limited electorate. Yet, even this mild democratic reform worried the establishment. But Alexis de Tocqueville, author of the famous Democracy in America, dispelled the fears of the nobility regarding the issue of the universal suffrage. He later stated what was true in the 1830s as it is true today, namely that people will vote as they are told to vote. To wit. The results of the recent American interim elections, or midterm elections, confirmed the pronouncement by Tocqueville as because the massive political, practical and anticipated changes failed in the promised expectations. And this notwithstanding evidence of widespread popular discontent and grievances, inflation, open borders, U.S. humiliating escape from Afghanistan, billions in foreign wars, and resistance against the excesses of wokeism, counterculture, rainbow advocacy, Black Lives Matters, and $2 billion in associated BLM-caused damages. 4. Either the results were rigged, or the elections, or the credulity of the electorate was stretched beyond imagination, or perhaps we're dealing with senseless happenings, or happenings that sense could not untie. Back to the main story and main events, leading to the current drama of the Western world. A reasonable beginning is the so-called Schuman Declaration of May 9th, 1950, establishing the European Coal and Steel Community. And this was a French-German initiative involving the French Robert Schuman and Jean Monnet, and the German Konrad Adenauer. Schuman and Monnet were CIA assets, and Adenauer did the best he could in the circumstances. Because not long before, Morgenthau, who was Roosevelt right-hand man, had him and Churchill sign the well-known Morgenthau Plan, intended to make the surviving Germans perennially poor and to convert Germany into a wasteland, and to prevent Germany from ever having another industry. The plan was discarded, but only because the Soviets had different designs for East Germany with easily imaginable consequences economically and politically if Morgenthau's plan had been implemented. Curiously omitted from the popular historical narrative of this era is the role of Count Kalergi, notorious advocate of the European Union and ever since honored by a yearly prize given to outstanding promoters of the Union. In his book Praktischer Idealismus, only available in German, Kalergi envisions a Europe led by the best of the chosen people, intermarried with the best of the Gentiles, and ruling over an Orwellian-style European prole, being a mixed breed of Gentiles intermarried with people imported from other continents and working in underground factories. Nor this is a question of distinguishing the absurd from the impossible or the incredible from the false. Ex-French President Sarkozy, whose ethnic roots are undisputed, said, "What is the objective? It is going to be controversial. The goal is to meet the challenge of mixed racial breeding, the challenge that faces us in the 21st century. It is not a choice, it is an obligation, it is imperative. We cannot do otherwise. We risk to be confronted with major problems. We must change, and therefore we will change." The US-sponsored plan for the European integration, so to speak, and as I said, spearheaded by Schuman and Monnet after World War II, advanced steadily until Charles de Gaulle tried to stop it in the 1950s. As we know, he was the pillar of the French resistance during World War II, but now he became an obstacle for America, as well documented in a good book by Vincent Nouzil, De secrets si bien gardés, which means well guarded secret. It's a book in French. It contains the dossiers of the White House and the CIA on France and her presidents. De Gaulle's plans clashed with those of the Americans. He made France independent of NATO, recognized Mao's China, traveled to Russia in 1966, and there was met with great honors at the peak of the Cold War. In a toast in Moscow, he said, "Russia seems to France to be an interlocutor with whom understanding and collaboration are natural to the highest degree." Perhaps de Gaulle had in mind King Francis I, who in 1536 established an alliance with Suleiman I, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, as a counterweight to the Spanish-Austrian Empire of Charles V. But there are more things in heaven and earth that are dreamt of in our philosophy, because the ensuing Moscow upheaval of 1968 was actually the first European color revolution. Its ideological promotion came from the same school that fueled various other color revolutions ever since. Critical in 1968, in the operation of 1968 in France, was the split within the powerful French Communist Party, of which the official section sided with de Gaulle, while the gauchists, or the leftists of a heavier color, were against him, even though de Gaulle was as remote from communism as a man could be. But he had to resign. Fueling and nourishing this mass movement, and eventually triggering in 1968 the Western Color Revolution, was the ideology defined as the Frankfurt School or cultural Marxism. Its spiritual father was Freudian psychologist Wilhelm Reich, who, with disciples or followers belonging to the same sect, such Theodor Adorno, Ernst Bloch, Erich Fromm, and Herbert Marcuse. Much critical information is lost in the swallowing gulf of blind forgetfulness and dark oblivion, but one sentence by one of the gurus may give a hint of the cultural Marxist ideology. The critique of domination, or the reflective critique of socially unnecessary constraints of human freedom, is as old as the Western concept of reason. Let's translate it. Reason is bunk. While for Marcuse, sexual promiscuity was the fulfillment of the need of the people to rise up against Western civilization and to free themselves of the sexual repression it creates. The color revolution of 1968 was not really a historical surprise, nor its sexual liberation agenda and novelty. The French Revolution harbored similar notions or ideology, and during the 1917 Russian Communist Revolution, it fell to Alexandra Kollontai, who was Lenin's secretary, to be the patroness of the liberated lifestyle, until Lenin intervened due to the sudden and dramatic collapse of the birth rate in Russia. An earlier sexual revolutionary was Shabtai Zevi, who lived from 1626 to 1678. Was a Jewish sexual revolutionary and believed also to be the Messiah. He urged his followers to engage in anything forbidden until that time, from eating pork to orgiastic sexuality. In this, he was ahead of later sexual revolutionaries like Sigmund Freud and Wilhelm Reich. According to David Bakan, who wrote Sigmund Freud and the Jewish Mystical Tradition, Freud considered himself a reincarnation of Shabtai Zevi. Like his inspirer, Freud promised release from sexual prohibition and guilt to the wealthy Americans as a way of bringing them, and more importantly, their money, under his control. In turn, Wilhelm Reich took the ideas learned from his master and converted them into the science of sexual liberation as a means of political control, resulting in the upheavals of 1968, when the chain of authority broke down, which restrains the bigot from thinking as he pleases and the slave from speaking as he thinks. Now, why, some may ask, the 1968 color revolution in France was successful, whether the Gilets jaunes color revolution of 40 years later wasn't. Considering that the grievances of the Gilets jaunes had practical objectives, whereas the sexual freedom of the 1968ers actually none had repressed. But it's very simple. Only spontaneous revolutions are successfully suppressed. At least that's my view. But never resting time moves history on, and not long later, at least historically speaking, European national currencies were turned into euros. And by so doing, the European currencies suffered the same fate as the East German mark, because before reunification, the West German mark was worth about 3 East German marks, which in turn made East German goods very competitive. But after reunification, the Eastern and Western marks were made equal in value, which meant that East German goods became 3 times more expensive literally overnight, and therefore uncompetitive, leading this in turn to millions becoming unemployed and massive closures of firms and factories eventually sold to speculators for literally pfennigs on the mark. As per available data and rationalizing the decimals, in 1950 1 French franc was worth 1.25 German marks. At the beginning of 2022, if there were no euro currency, 1 German mark would be worth respectively 2.80 French francs and 3.50 Italian liras. Now, the virtuousness of an economy is, of course, a relative evaluation. While the subject would require books to avoid the charge of uttering platitudes, German, French, and Italian customs, traditions, and lifestyles, as we know, were and are still different. Their respective economies, therefore, reflect these differences and could only be forcefully integrated, leaving, if you like, all parties dissatisfied. The virtuous economy complaining for supporting the others, and the others for having to reduce or dismantle their social structure and protections adopted after World War II. By the way, and for the sake of parallels, debasing the currency or pretending that it is worthier than what it is also contributed to the eventual demise of the Roman Empire. By 265 AD, there was only 0.5% silver left in what was called a denarius, their currency, left throughout the empire, and only barbarian mercenaries were paid in gold. With soaring logistical and administrative costs and no more precious metals available from conquered enemies, taxes were increased to sustain the empire. And the combination of hyperinflation, taxes, and worthless money contributed to the dissolution of the Roman economy. In this thoroughly incomplete analysis, I will finally deal with the twist introduced by the Ukrainian war. The United States managed to force Russia into an intervention intended to destroy the Russian leadership and simultaneously stabilize the U.S. economy at the expense of Europe's, as well as preventing Europe from expanding commercially, technological, and, God forbid, political relations with Russia. At least this is the essence of a Rand Corporation, or if you like the CIA, or a Rand Corporation document published in January 2022. Perhaps anticipated in the US, Forcing Europe to detach from Russia and the resources of Russia would mean intolerable energy prices and economic disaster. But to kill a friend to prevent him from being a rival is also part of being exceptional. Still, each medal has another side. Having forced Russia to intervene, the United States has been drawn into a conflict that it cannot refuse, given the risk of destructions of the Washington Consensus. Yet it is a conflict the US is unlikely to win, considering the evolution of military technologies. A nuclear confrontation, as we know, would shatter the Western alliance, nor the rest of the world has been blind to the theft of Russian assets and probably has drawn some conclusions. As all know, the loser is Europe, though its geopolitical interests are different from Washington. Meanwhile, that interesting character called John Bolton, prime warmonger of the US establishment, has conveyed the tone of the time by stating that Putin has gained the right of being assassinated. Against the will of de Gaulle, Europe has become a vassal with no sovereignty and almost a prisoner of itself or herself. And this is also historically meaningful that French President Mitterrand, a few weeks before his death, confessed to his biographer that France is engaged in a war with America, and it is a war to the death. The last reflections of this video refers to the mutually supporting phenomena of the COVID pandemic and of Klaus Schwab's Great Reset. There is nothing new really here except some conclusions inevitably suggested by the recent turn of events. Readers will be aware of the extraordinary statement produced by the main vaccine manufacturer, Pfizer, according to whom the COVID vaccine does not prevent the spreading of the illness, but only reduces the gravity of its effect among the affected. And second point, the vaccine was introduced before having been tested. Nevertheless, on September 7, 2022, the Pentagon has awarded Pfizer a contract for $4,852 million plus for its new COVID vaccine. Anyway, whether by default or by design, the vaccine passport has proven a useful instrument to test the validity of a Western social credit system, Chinese style. According to qualified sources, France will introduce, for example, in the near future, what they call the numeric euro, managed and handled by one central bank only, whereupon the bank, meaning the state, will know on what, where and when each citizen has disposed of his money, including how much electricity or fuel he has consumed. Therefore, if he exceeds certain pre-assigned limits, he could be penalized and, like in China, become the target of retaliation. If all of the above were played upon a stage, many would condemn it as improbable fiction. But we are now used to believe anything, provided it is quite incredible. Thank you for watching, and until next time, may all the number of the stars give light to your fairway. Good night.